Okay, hello everybody. If you are here for the Family Business Entrepreneurship Report launch by Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, you are very, very welcome to our webinar, and we'll just give a few minutes, 1 minute actually, or two, for others to join. Thank you. So we're just waiting for more participants to join our webinar for the Family Business Entrepreneurship Report. Just bear with us for just 1 more minute, please. Thank you. Okay, I see that we are still in having participants join up, so I'll just give it a few more seconds. Thank you. Okay. All right, well, it's a real pleasure to be here today talking to everyone who's out there and who is interested and involved with family businesses across the globe, whether you are practitioners or academics. We're here for the launch of our Family Business Entrepreneurship Report. You'll hear a lot more about that in a moment. But for those who do not know GEM, I think it's important for me to just give a few sentences about what GEM is, Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. It's a consortium of national country teams that are primarily associated with top academic institutions, and we carry out survey-based research on entrepreneurship across the world. In fact, GEM is the only global research source that collects data on entrepreneurship directly from individual entrepreneurs. And we do this in 2 primary ways. We run the GEM Adult Population Survey, which provides an analysis on the characteristics, motivations, and ambitions of individuals starting businesses, as well as social attitudes towards entrepreneurship. We also run what we call the National Expert Survey, and it looks at the national context in which individuals start businesses. This gives us unique GEM tools and data that benefit numerous stakeholder groups, and the academic community is clearly a primary stakeholder of ours. And I would like to introduce today, well, first of all, I could say that Babson College was a founding organisation of GEM, along with London Business School. And so it's a great pleasure today to welcome William Gartner, who is the Bertarelli Foundation Distinguished Professor of Family Entrepreneurship at Babson College. And he's there, hi Matt, or hi Bill. So it's Bill rather than William. And then we have Matthew Allen, or Matt, who is the Associate Professor in the Entrepreneurship Division at Babson College. And thirdly, we're delighted to welcome a practitioner on board with us today, Ramia Marielle El Agamy, who is the editor-in-chief of Tharawat Magazine, a global publication for family businesses, and a product, and in itself it is a family business because this is a product established by the El Agamy family. And so today we hope to cover a number of subjects related to the findings of this report. And I'm going to kick off actually with our practitioner, with Ramia, because Ramia has long experience with multiple family businesses across the globe, as well as being an entrepreneur herself. Could you perhaps set a bit of context for us in a few sentences, Ramia? It's a very particular time in history, I think. How do you see family business entrepreneurship evolving globally? How did you see it before the pandemic that we're currently experiencing, and since the crisis? Like, what were the main open questions regarding entrepreneurship in particular for you, and have these changed since the pandemic set in?
Thank you so much for having me in this webinar. I'm very excited to hear more about the results of the report, which looks very interesting, and we were so grateful for more data on this subject. So very much looking forward to this discussion today. I think to your question, which is a fairly big one, I would say, I think it's important to understand maybe also where we draw our information from, since we are, if you will, storytellers of family business histories. It's very interesting to see family businesses confronting such an interesting moment of crisis this year, because of course many family businesses draw on decades of experience in dealing with various economic circumstances, various social circumstances. So this was a big year for the whole economy, but family businesses probably in particular, in terms of showing their true colors. I think before the pandemic truly hit, or before I think we realized that it was going to create permanent change, family businesses and family or multi-generational entrepreneurs, if you want to call them that, we're very much busy with, I think, what we were all busy with, which is, primarily the challenges that come with digitalization, a fourth industrial revolution that was in itself already making certain industries redundant, or, breaking up things. I think, we have these are contemporary challenges, I would say. We have the contemporary challenge, or I would call it the opportunity, of an increasingly female leadership in family businesses as well, which has definitely shifted how family businesses function. And I think that those have been trends that we've observed that have been going on for a while, but that are, I would say, that are contemporary to the times we live in. These are clear trends and responses to the times we live in. But there are, of course, the age-old issues of the family-run or family-owned, project or enterprise, or whatever you want to call it, whether it's a company or whether it's something else. And these are the topics of succession and good governance, and actually, amongst others, and this is what I think we'll discuss today, how to keep the entrepreneurial spirit alive across generations, or how to foster a positive and constructive entrepreneurial spirit that will contribute to the agility of whatever project or organization the family has a vested interest in. What COVID has done, I think I see it in two phases, and I've seen it with my own family as well. What COVID has done is there was this first, I believe when we first all realized what this meant, we've seen many family businesses truly, and as this is what I meant by showing their true colors, putting on their capes and just being absolute heroes. Like, many family businesses have changed whole production lines towards, really helping out with masks, helping out with disinfectants. Many family businesses reaching out to their communities, helping people who lost their jobs. Family businesses tend to be very embedded in their communities, so they've really lived up to that. I think the emergency response that we've seen has been overwhelmingly positive, depending on the sector, of course, but mostly positive. I think what now is the next switch, or the next stage that we're at now, and this is why this conversation is particularly important, I think, is to go from emergency response to back to what we're known for, which is the long-term planning of, of the sustainability of the businesses. And because COVID has shown at least a probability of these kinds of things happening, more often, or that even this pandemic will have lasting effects, we have to question our business models, and that requires entrepreneurial thinking, entrepreneurial spirit in the family enterprise. So I think a very timely discussion to have this now, as we shift from emergency response mode towards understanding that this is the new reality we're dealing with, and how will we now adapt our business models to be resilient for generations to come.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was actually a fascinating introduction, and covered, I mean, there are so many topics one can cover in this whole area. I'm going to zoom in now, though, to the findings of the study. Bill, can you perhaps give us an overview on the background to the study, the kinds of questions that were included, and the thinking behind those questions?
Sure, thank you, Aileen. If we could go to the next slide. Oh, then the next slide. Good. So Aileen's already covered, no, back one, sorry. Aileen's already covered some of this. It's been over 20 years that GEM has really been the authority on entrepreneurial activity around the world. And I do want to emphasize that it's really one of the most sophisticated research projects on entrepreneurship that exists. It's randomized, generalizable, and can speak to almost any country where the survey is done. It's focused on individuals who start and run businesses. And typically the question is, are you alone or with others actively involved in getting into business? It's phrased slightly differently. But the point is that GEM is focusing on entrepreneurial activity, both in emerging and new businesses that are 5 years or younger. And then there's also a part of the survey on own businesses. Surprisingly, over this 20 years, there hasn't really been a question about the relationship of families to the startup process. So in 2018, we asked 3 questions. And if we could go to the next slide. We added these 3 questions. And I also want to emphasize this. In survey research, when it's this large and this randomized, it's actually quite expensive to do it. So to add 3 questions was very, very expensive. And that's why these questions haven't been asked before. But what we were interested then is trying to parse out what family entrepreneurship is about and how families are engaged. So as you can see here, we were asked, are they involved in a family business that's co-owned with family members or other relatives? The second asked, were they co-managed with family relatives or others? And the third was, did they expect family members to be a part of where the family business grew over this period of time? So with that, I think we'll go to the next slide. So here's basically how this would play out. We'd have co-managed, not co-owned, co-owned, and not co-managed, and not co-owned. As you can see, then there's 3 quadrants of differences in the kinds of family involvement and activity that could be a part of what families are in relationship to entrepreneurship.
Okay.
So Matt, at this point, how would you define family entrepreneurship then?
Yes, because I think it's a good thing to get the definition straight in any kind of research. Yeah, what precisely do we mean by family entrepreneurship?
Yeah, and at Babson, Bill and I talk about this question quite a bit. It's probably our favorite question to get because the power behind changing the way we look at families and entrepreneurship from a research and a practice perspective has some key implications. So how do we define family entrepreneurship? Historically, I think as academics, we looked at family entrepreneurship as families that just happen to be entrepreneurial. And the result of that approach was we mostly looked at family businesses. So we were looking at the business that the family founded. And if that business happened to be an entrepreneurial business, then we would say that's family entrepreneurship because it's a family business that's being entrepreneurial. Mm-hmm. But more recently, we have recognized the importance of the family in that process. And so our view of family entrepreneurship is really what happens inside a family that promotes or maybe inhibits entrepreneurial behaviors. And when you look at it from the perspective of the family and not from the perspective of the business, it expands a lot what we're looking at. So to have family entrepreneurship, you don't necessarily need to have a family business or a family business that doesn't happen to go to the next generation doesn't mean that that family is no longer entrepreneurial. In fact, in many cases, family businesses that don't pass to the next generation don't pass on to the next generation because the family has gone a different direction with a different entrepreneurial venture. And then we see in that definition some other behaviors like couples being entrepreneurial together or siblings being entrepreneurial together, or a family that has a business, but the next generation actually goes out and starts new businesses on their own. And we could also include in that family philanthropy, family offices. So really, the definition of family entrepreneurship is understanding what families do to support and promote entrepreneurial behaviors.
Great. Actually, Ramia, it'd be quite interesting to get a feed in there from your side on, how would you react to what you've just heard? Does that kind of resonate with you?
Well, I find it very, it's always interesting, of course, to look at something that you live in reality in such a informal and normal day-to-day way, and to look at it from such a structured perspective is always wonderfully enlightening. I feel like for us, I think from our perspective, any family endeavor, whether it be, as you said, I think, Matt, is important to distinguish that I agree with you. A company is not necessarily the only outcome that qualifies as, a family project or a family endeavor that adds value. But in any family endeavor, I do feel that entrepreneurship plays a different role at different stages. And I'm just specifically triggered for this response with regards to the distinction that you made here between co-owned and co-managed, which is very interesting to me to see, because I think, at the founding stage of anything that a family does, so call it a startup or call it a new venture that we start, entrepreneurship is everything. So everything is entrepreneurial. It's the culture of everything. The moment we decide that we want to protract this into including other generations of the family or even more family members, it feels that we are come up against this ownership question, right? Because at the beginning, the ownership question really doesn't matter, because there's this building foundational moment that is very entrepreneurial and probably less formal. But as soon, and sometimes this coincides with the transition into a second generation, you get suddenly, of course, the question of who does this belong to becomes more important, because probably whatever concern you've built is growing. Like, there's more to be considered. And I think the management and the ownership question changes depending on the size of the operation and depending on how many non-family members you start involving at a significant level, because that's what makes us families start, stop behaving like we're all sitting at the kitchen table, pulling together, like, whatever we're doing, towards a more formalized environment. So I think for me, this is very interesting to see you make this distinction. And I'd be interested to learn more about what it is that you found out in terms of that differentiation, in terms of numbers. But I do think for me, it's very clear that entrepreneurship changes over time and sort of like has a different type of impact. And I think to the definition of what is family entrepreneurship, we should probably also add that the definition of family is very different from across cultures. I think that's an added perspective, right? Like, so the fact that, I've operated in many different countries, and I've seen that the definition of what people constitute as being their family is very different from culture to culture. So from my
interesting.
We're informed from a more collective notion. The extended family is part of that definition. And, maybe from a Western perspective, we're talking more about the nuclear family. So I think that also impacts, like, the opportunities that you have and what you would call family involvement necessarily. So I'm very interested in understanding more about the numbers that you've seen here.
And we're just about to dive into the numbers, actually. Ramia, thank you very much. Bill, what I kind of call it the aha from this research, the most remarkable or noteworthy finding as a result of the research, something that will make a real difference. Yeah.
Let's go on to the next slide here.
Okay.
The big aha, that top line: 75% of entrepreneurs and 81% of established business owners co-own or co-manage with the family. So if there's any major takeaway from this survey today, and what we all want you to walk away with, is that entrepreneurship is family entrepreneurship around the world. Okay. And as you can see too, the family business established owners more than 5. So to me, that's really the powerful aspect of where this research goes. But we've got a lot of data. You know, Ramia, some issues that you brought up, we're going to be able to talk about in terms of what does co-management look like and co-ownership.
Yeah. Shall we move to Matt? And I think, Matt, you know, what explains the fact that there are such high levels of family entrepreneurship? What's driving the numbers?
Thanks, Eileen. Yeah, this is the question. I mean, for those who, I asked my students the other day in my class about this question. I said, what % of entrepreneurship do you think is driven by family? And there were lots of different guesses, but I would say the average across the class was maybe 15 or 20%. So to have people believe that it's 15 to 20% and to see that in reality it's more like 75 to 80%, that's a pretty big difference. And I think that is the question that needs to be answered. At this point, we can talk about what theory might explain, but this is the question that research is going to have to follow up on in order to understand what is going on here. From my perspective, I think there's a couple of things. I think one, and this will resonate with all of us because we all come from families. Ramia talked about different types of families, but we all recognize some sort of familial bond in some way. And for those of us that, when you consider your family, we don't do much anything without informing and engaging and drawing support from our family, whether it's an educational endeavor or a new job or a new hobby or anything else. If you think about how we as people tend to approach things, we engage our family. And so it shouldn't be surprising to us that when we pursue something entrepreneurial, we're likely going to engage our family in that process, and we're going to bring them in and have them help us. So I think at a general level, that explains it. But if we get a little bit deeper, entrepreneurship involves risk. And entrepreneurs, at least what the research tells us, is that the goal of entrepreneurs as they pursue this risk, they want to minimize the risk and maximize their success rates. And family represents a perfect tool or resource to engage in this process because the relationships are already established, the trust is there, we understand what they know and what they bring to the table. And so it's much easier for us to engage a family member as a partner, as a co-owner in this process because of that trust, because of our knowledge of what they bring to the table and what they understand. And so I think that relationship part also explains a little bit what we're seeing in these very high numbers of entrepreneurial endeavors that involve family.
And I think we might want to go to the next slide to talk a little bit more about where some of those things are.
Okay.
So a couple of things I think to emphasize here in this slide is that the largest percentage is family co-managed, not co-owned. And our speculation about that is that we basically see families as enablers of the entrepreneurial process. Okay, so it's not necessarily that families are basically creating owner-built businesses and creating another owner-built business, but they're enabling family members to act entrepreneurially in new ways and using family support basically to help out family members be entrepreneurial. And that actually fits with the entrepreneurship literature. From what we know is the startup process is not at the beginning a capital-intensive process. It's an emotionally supportive process where enablers help individuals pursue their dreams and make things happen. And I think we're seeing this here in this family co-managed and not co-owned aspect where families enable entrepreneurial activity to happen. It's not necessarily, as we see here, kind of co-owned starting businesses or co-owned and co-managed. It really is a support function that's really, really critical for entrepreneurial activity to happen. But, you know, Matt, this I think might be a time for us both to play with some of these issues on what we're seeing here in this chart.
Okay, Ramia, would you like to throw any light on anything that's being said by either Bill or Matt?
Yeah, I think I mean,
yes,
largely I would agree that I think that it's not surprising, I would say, to see a high level of family involvement at the startup phase or the entrepreneurial phase. I agree with that. I think anyone who is an entrepreneur understands that it's a very well, it's more a lifestyle, isn't it, than it is like an actual, like a job. It's really a decision that demands a lot of sacrifice. It seems natural and organic to me that family involvement, whether measured or not, is definitely there in a supportive role or in a proactive role. I agree. I think there are a lot of intangibles there as well that probably aren't even reflected here, and might even increase these numbers if you were able to measure them. So no surprise there. I think I do feel that for me, like maybe I have a more a less romantic or view of it. Of course, like also see the fact that it's family's cheap labor. Like it's obviously there's, as you said before, there's not a lot of capital in the beginning. Like we work for nothing, we work for little. Like I've done it to my sisters have done it to me, and so have our parents. So I think this is just a very natural thing to do. I do think that trust plays a huge role in it as well, and I think that the trust with a new business idea or something, their likelihood of trusting a family member with that kind of information might be higher. I think there's maybe, even depending on the family, there's a collective culture of failure or a collective culture around success, which might help. So I think whether you build your business in spite of or with your family will always have a role, right? Like in a way, I guess, like whether it's to show them, to prove them wrong, or to build something with them. I guess like ultimately they'll always have some sort of an input. So no surprise, but pleased to see that the numbers, I would say, confirm the general impression and the reality that we live every day.
And what we'd like to do now is to go even deeper into the numbers. So Bill, can you bring us through some of the country and regional differences, and perhaps point to some of the interesting findings or your own observations about them?
Sure, let's go to the next slide.
Thank you.
So to offer some interpretation here, because there's a lot going on here and where that is. So if you can look at the bottom, the yellow is non-family, the gray is co-managed and not co-owned, which is the majority. And then we have co-managed, co-owned and not co-managed, which is a small little light green sliver. And then we have co-owned and co-managed. And as you can see, the variation across country is large. We go all the way from Thailand, where basically 100% of all businesses have some family relationship. And as you can see, primarily most of that is family co-managed, not co-owned. And then we go all the way to the other side in Asia, of Japan and China, where we have primarily non-family owned startups and or non-family related startups. So as you can see, it varies by country. Co-managed, not co-owned, basically indicating that there's a family relationship, but not necessarily ownership involved, is the predominant form. But that then varies. You can look at the UAE and see, for example, that we have co-owned and co-managed is a significant part, almost 50% of the businesses that are started there. So a lot of variation across the board. And again, one of the things that Ramia had pointed out earlier, we see that this is likely to affect cultural differences and how families behave and how we think about what a family is. But probably in countries like China, that has certain political processes that have emphasized state-owned roles for startups and less family orientation, that we see less family supported businesses in places like China. But it is surprising that both Taiwan, China, and Japan have the smallest ratio of family-supported businesses in the world. So I think there is probably some cultural things.
Some cultural factors in there. I just want to remind our audience that you can put some Q&A, questions in the Q&A section. Not in the chat, please, in the Q&A section. And at the end of the webinar, in the last 15 minutes or so, we will be delighted to address them. We did have one question about which countries actually participated, and there you have it up there in the slide. And I think the slides can be made available after the webinar, right, Bill and Matt? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Well, the report is actually due too, so you'll be able to download from the GEM website a complete copy of the report and significant details about how the survey was administered and done, as well as a lot more background into the countries and the specific statistics, because we're only showing a chart here, but we've got actual numbers for you in the report.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And Matt, another interesting finding is the fact that family entrepreneurship rates seem to go up as you move from early stage entrepreneurship to established businesses. So isn't this somewhat counterintuitive, or can you give us some views on why that is?
Yes, I think depending on your assumptions, this could be counterintuitive. So if we go back to what Ramia said about cheap labor, and I know that's not the only thing that we look at, but if you assume that families or entrepreneurs involve the family because they can't afford others, or they don't have access to more valuable resources, then you would expect that as you moved from entrepreneurial businesses into the established businesses, the level of family involvement would go down. Mm-hmm. Because as the business becomes more successful, we now have access to regular employees and perhaps more knowledgeable assets. But what we're seeing here, and this is fascinating to me, the level of family involvement is actually going up. And so I think what this tells us is that there's more to it. I would not argue against the inexpensive labor or the ready access or any of the arguments we've made. I think they're all valid and true. But what we're seeing is that there's something more here. There is a value that comes from involving family in the business that goes beyond just the startup phase and the access to resources that maybe we don't have. And one of the things that I think we're seeing here is the ability of working together on any endeavor, but especially a business, in bringing the family together or creating a level of family unity. As I talk to my students that I teach at Babson about what is different about working in a family business, oftentimes they will say to me, well, because we have a business, we have another reason to engage as a family. We have another opportunity to work together, to be together. And they see that as an asset, not as a drawback. And they think they actually feel sorry for other families that don't have this reason to be together, additional reason to be together. And so I think as families start together and as they engage the family in this process, they start to grow together as a family around this business. And it actually brings in more family members and engages the entire family in the process. For those that are part of a family business, you don't really separate the business from the family. It becomes part of the fabric of the family. And so as that business grows, I can imagine, or I can see how that business would begin to engage more family members and bring more family members in and actually strengthen the original relationships that were started at the beginning of that business.
Yes, and I saw Bill applauding when Ramia mentioned trust. So I guess one reason to keep family members in the business as moving forward is trust, actually, and apart from all the other factors that you mentioned. Ramia, any comment, further comment on that? Or?
Oh yeah, lots actually on this one, to be honest with you. No, because I think I agree, but I also disagree in a way. I think because it's, of course, from my perspective, and again, like there's a highly subjective view and probably just an amalgamation of everything that I've seen in the interviews that we've done with family businesses everywhere. Bill, with regards to the chart that you just showed about, like, how certain countries show less of a signal of family involvement, I do think it matters here to understand what cultures take for granted in terms of family support and what they don't. So I think, like, in a more collective culture, it is, for instance, totally normal that, your family would help you host a small business retreat with your employees. Like, these are things that in certain cultures we don't think anything of, whereas in others we would constitute that like an active participation by the family, right? Like, so that measure, I would be interested in hearing more about how do we start to quantify that? Because I think the respondents might have been like, I've spoken to just recently a family business in Switzerland where the patriarch sat there, and I asked him, do you consider your wife to have contributed to the success of your business? And he says, No, not really. She's only planned every single anniversary party, every single birthday party of the employees. That's all she does. And I was sitting there and thinking like, yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because the level of how he took that level of involvement for granted did not make him answer in what we would consider family. We would consider that family involvement, right? You consider her to be an active part of the success of the culture of the business.
Yes.
That's like one thing I wanted to just like mention to, I'd be interested to hear your comments on that. The other thing is, for me, the definition of roles in the family enterprise is a big ongoing discussion. So you have to understand, like, until you come to the point where you get a job description as a family member, some time will elapse usually, I think. And I think this is also interesting to understand. Like, so how do we define these roles? And usually what we've seen is that roles start becoming important, job titles start becoming important for family members, the more non-family employees start joining the company. Because to be fair to them, we then have to start being clearer on who does what from the family's perspective, because otherwise you get this whole nepotism thing that comes in. So I feel like part of that, Matt, like what you said about that, we see a high involvement of family even later on in the established business. I understand. I'm not even sure if it's actually an increase or if it's just that we finally acknowledge how much family members do for the business, right? Like, or how many of them actually technically have a job in the business. So I think, this is also like a little bit linked to the life cycle stage and to the requirements of transparency, good management practices towards people who are not part of the business, but who are starting to contribute significantly to the success of what you do. So those are just like some thoughts that occurred to me while you were discussing the results.
Thanks, Ramia. And actually, it connects very well with the next question, which is for Bill. Can you talk about what we found about the different forms of family involvement and employment in both the entrepreneurial process as well as in managing established businesses?
Let's go on to a next couple of slides. So let's see the next slide. So this can give you some sense of that. In terms of what we look at in terms of co-management and just co-ownership for families and non-families. Again, as Ramia has pointed out, there are significant cultural differences across all of these countries. I mean, we can talk about Asia as a geographical area, but we can certainly see that there's different cultural contacts that are happening. Whereas we have almost all of the business startups and in Thailand being family startups, where we see little in other ways. And that might, as Ramia have been pointed out, an issue that maybe that's just about how they think about who's family or not and what their contribution is to the nature of that context. And again, that I think is the exciting aspect of where this research will go when we begin to meld entrepreneurship with family studies, to realize we're not now looking at family businesses and issues of succession. We're really looking at how families act entrepreneurial over time. So to me, again, the power of this is that you can really see, again, the highlight really of this presentation and the big takeaway is that families matter for entrepreneurial activity. And the graph to me really points out that families make a significant difference in who's likely to start businesses or not.
Okay, Matt.
I know we want to, go ahead,
yes,
Matt.
Go ahead. Okay, either Matt or Ramia, if you wish to jump in on anything there, very happy. Otherwise, I can move on to wrap up a little bit with the three of you.
So just maybe if we could go to that last slide, and I'll just make a couple of comments.
Sure.
It's interesting to me, so far we've been talking about co-ownership and co-management, but not necessarily employment. And I think this gets to Ramia's comment that she made about formalizing the relationship with family. It could be that co-management early on is an informal agreement between partners that they're starting a business together. But when we talk about employment, I think we're talking about formalizing that relationship. And it's interesting to see that families, even as they look to the future, so you might think that family involvement, again, is just an artifact of access and trust, and it's just close proximity. But even when you ask them, what are you thinking about in the future for the entrepreneurs, almost 60% expect that the majority of their employees over time will be family members. And then that's just not an expectation, because if you turn and look at those established businesses, the numbers are pretty close. 62% state that the majority of their employees are in fact family members. And so you can see how, and maybe it is as the business evolves and we formalize relationships, family involvement continues to be an important aspect. And there's lots of different reasons that this might be the case. It could be that we're just providing income and opportunities and growth to family members because we have this business entity. So why not allow this business entity to benefit broader numbers of people? And if we're going to benefit somebody, it ought to be family. That might be a viewpoint from a nepotism perspective of we help out our own, but it also could be a development of the business around the family where informally the family was already engaged in the process anyway. You know, people were doing, I hear stories about kids helping with packaging and putting labels on letters at home. And it's just natural that that would transition over time into more formal engagements of what they were already doing.
I'd love to emphasize where Matt went with that, to say, I think one of the things, you know, if you look at what we're doing at Babson is really to promote entrepreneurship of all kinds. And our concern always is, how do we educate everyone to act more entrepreneurial? And what we're seeing here is that, well, what's the best place to educate individuals to be entrepreneurs? Their families. You know, it's like if we think about entrepreneurship as being what we're trying to do, communities of practice, what's the best community of practice to promote entrepreneurship? Well, that's family entrepreneurship, where families really provide that tacit and overt knowledge to really help individuals move forward. So, you know, to me, the big the challenge now, or at least, is to recognize, my God, families play an important role. And can we do something for families and help families really continue to engage, you know, across generations and across the family system to be more entrepreneurial?
I just would like to just add one slide perspective here maybe to it, whereby I do think we need to make a difference between when we speak of families that are functional and families that are dysfunctional, which we're dealing with a lot, right? Like, and I think this is, I think one of my notes here to this conversation has been that over time, I've really seen both. I've seen the family involvement be the reason why it succeeds, beyond anyone's wildest dreams, because the type of commitment we bring in because it's family, the type of values we share because it's family, that kind of shared vision that comes in quite naturally to many of us, can be a very powerful thing, as we've seen by virtue of many family legacies. We're just about to issue a collection on families that have lasted more than 1,000 years. So there's something there for sure. But I also think we have to be wary of the fact that it is also potentially the reason why we fail. You know, dysfunctional dynamics in family relationships can lead to damaging the business. It can lead to damaging, and not only the business, and the business by extension, the jobs we've created for others. And right now during this COVID, just to bring it back, I mean, maybe to the current, you know, you asked me at the beginning, what do you see in this current context? So as I said, I really see both. I see those families that live up heroically to everything we want and hope them to be in terms of their values, etc. But I also see businesses that are stuck because of the family involvement, because the family involvement at that stage does not equate with entrepreneurial spirit anymore, but rather equates with everything that is risk-averse behavior to hold on to what's there and not take the next step. So I agree, entrepreneurial spirit is something that needs to be fostered, but also we need to work on family dynamics and healthy family relationships that would actually allow us to leverage on such an entrepreneurial spirit and direct it into the right directions.
Right. I think so. We'd like in say 2-3 minutes to move to some questions. So I'm going to give an opportunity for a kind of wrap-up statement from all three of you, and just really keep it very short, 1-2 sentences. Bill, what is the implications of this report for family entrepreneurship research in general, and what kind of contribution has GEM made here?
I think the critical one is to look at families as another level of analysis. GEMS tended to focus on individuals acting entrepreneurially. And now we've asked the questions, do families influence that process? And the answer is yes, in significant ways. Those high percentages, 75% and 81%, I think are things to really pay attention to.
And you feel that, say, the academic community will be pointing to this report as being maybe a little bit of a game changer, or not so much, or?
Yes, I think family business studies has tended to be about succession issues with established businesses. And we've had very poor statistics on the nature of families acting entrepreneurially. So I think now we can say families are a major influence. We've got, I think, some very powerful information that's very solid to say families make a big difference in entrepreneurial activity. And we need now to pay attention to that. Just as we think about corporate entrepreneurship as a way to be entrepreneurial, or individual entrepreneurship, or high tech, now I think we've got to say family entrepreneurship is really critical. We need more study and thought about it. And one last thing, Ramia brought up about family functioning. I want to make a big celebration of Matt Allen. That's really his expertise and specialty, is really focusing on how do families really work through those family functioning things to be more entrepreneurial. So, our research is going in there, our teaching is going in that direction, and I'm really excited for the future in this area.
Okay, and Matt, what do you think are the implications of the report for families in business today? What is that for you? What's the implication?
So I think there's a couple of implications, and one that Bill mentioned already from a policy perspective, that's practical at a big level, but we have often, as a country looks at improving entrepreneurial behavior, tends to look at individuals. If you look at what governments do to support entrepreneurship, they tend to focus on individual entrepreneurs. The assumption is that's who we need to focus on. That is not the case. If you look at this study, that would be the complete wrong approach. If you really want to drive entrepreneurship at a country level, the best way to go about it is going to be to support entrepreneurial families. And I would say at a practical level, what did the families take away from this? I would encourage families to think about entrepreneurship as a behavior and activity that should be encouraged. So sometimes families will actually discourage entrepreneurship because they think that it has negative connotations for the future of the business, right? Children that are entrepreneurial will leave the business and go start their own business. But I see that as positive all around. The families that tend to be successful long-term are the families that tend to keep that entrepreneurial spirit over the years. Ramia talked a little bit about families that lose that drive and then the business declines. The most successful multi-generational family businesses, what you will see is that maybe there's a core business in generation one, and then as that cascades across generations, you'll see the core business continue to exist, but you'll see new businesses at the family level that exist in generation 2, 3, 4, and 5. And it's actually an entrepreneurial legacy across all generations and tends to make the family successful, not on that core business, but that core business and multiple other businesses.
Thanks, Matt. And Ramia, what would be the main takeaway for you from a practitioner perspective?
It's very gratifying to see research done on something that we find so important and that we live as a reality every day. So it's fantastic to see this done. I also quite agree that I think it should help us celebrate maybe a type of entrepreneurship that is much more frequent, but gets rather overlooked besides the glamour of maybe more of a Silicon Valley kind of an imbued vision of what a startup should look like or what entrepreneurship looks like. And my sisters and I discussed that we really appreciate that the familial entrepreneurship is taking center stage in this. It feels good because there's a lot of, as I said, a lot of unsung heroes out there that are doing incredible work. And just to Matt's point, I think you made a very important point there, is that I think the only way that then that kind of entrepreneurial spirit can remain alive across generations is by allowing the next generation to apply its own definition of success and be allowed to, maybe treat the family business like a startup in every generation in a way, because I think that would be definitely the solution to a lot of succession issues that we're also having. So to give that freedom. And we've definitely seen the most successful family businesses being the ones who have given that free rein. You're absolutely right there, Matt. And I would really very much support that statement.
So thank you. Thank you to the panelists for this great introduction to, I mean, I think I have the feeling that we just kind of skimmed the surface of what might be presented here. And so we do really encourage you to download the report and go there for a lot more information about the findings. Now, when I look at the questions, I'm realizing that we have quite a lot of commentary, you know, so I'm going to read out some commentary, and if anyone of the panelists want to pick up on anything that has been said, I'll just encourage you to do so. Please just raise your finger. And so interesting findings, is Motlodi Pitse says, has South Africa and any Southern African country being covered in this study? And he comments, it will be interesting to see how family co-ownership and co-management play themselves out. Okay, and now from Maria Mumby, I'd like to learn more about nepotism and the effects of that on company culture, I guess family business company culture, right? Francesco Ferrante says, I think that the type of internal organization, that is hierarchy versus delegation, use of performance-related pay systems, is an important dimension of family business affecting its performance. Let me see. The benefit of control is a relevant motivation to set up family businesses. Don't you think that this may be a source of dysfunctional dynamics? Okay, that's just a kind of suite of things that we've cut from the Q&A. Not very many questions there, but comments more like. Would anyone like to react to that? Bill, Matt, and Ramia?
So I just want to react quickly to the nepotism comment. I am not a nepotism researcher and I don't have an understanding of that, but I do have some thoughts about this idea of nepotism. And I'll just say this, nepotism as a word tends to have a negative connotation. And so when it is applied to family businesses, it tends to be critical of the family's approach. My experience talking with and working with families is that what the outsiders view as nepotism, families just view as family. And I grew up in a family business. I have to tell you, my first probably 6 or 7 part-time jobs were based on relationships that my father had with other businesses. And I would have never considered that nepotism. I would just consider that it was the resource that I had available to me. And so I took advantage of it. It would have been silly for me to try to go out and get a job outside of that network because it would have been much more difficult. And so when we talk about things like nepotism, whether it's negative or positive, you know, of course, if we're nepotistic to the point that we bring in an incapable manager or leader just for the sake of having a family member, that can be a significant issue. But if we're bringing in family instead of non-family because we have a relationship, because they're there, because we know them, I don't know that that's negative. And so if I were to research in that area, I think one of the questions is more about when is it useful to engage family as opposed to non-family, and when is it not useful, so that families could better understand in what circumstances they should be more or less nepotistic.
Right. Any other comments? I have another question, actually, an interesting one, but any other comments there? No? Okay. What about women and the role of women in family businesses? Was that included in the survey? Were you able to get some interesting findings there? What do you think?
Well, it's interesting. This came up at Babson just yesterday. We had an exchange of emails because the report got released and many questions about this. I think the answer is, with a little bit more analysis and digging deeper into the data, I think there will be some findings that could become available, but it's not readily available from the data. You're not going to see it in the report. But I just want to echo a little bit of what Ramia said at the very beginning of this webinar. As cultures change, as generations change, I am seeing much, much more openness. If I'll just give an example, 20 years ago, if I had talked to an owner of a construction company about his daughter's involvement, he would probably be surprised that I had even asked, because in his mind, no, daughters don't get involved in an industry like construction. But when I talk to my families now, it's not just that they're thinking about it as a possibility. It's gone beyond that. They're actually very excited to see their daughters engaged. And this is crossing industries that might be more typically considered male. This is also crossing countries that might more typically be considered masculine in their approach to business. And so just from anecdotal evidence that I see in my students and the interviews that I'm doing, I think we're going to see an explosive transition in women and leadership and involvement in family businesses.
Well, yes, I absolutely agree with you there. And I would have thought that there is an explosion in family businesses in general, because I can think of many scenarios where I know of employees in organizations with multinationals or etc. They all have, you know, a budding family business on the side, increasingly today, you know, with gig economy, etc., etc. So it's
I just maybe share a thought on
go
this.
ahead, Ramia. Yes.
I'm very aware of bias around this conversation. I feel like because we've been trying to build up, and we've always said that the women in family business conversation is not a glass ceilings conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Because as what you said, Matt, before as well, you're born into a family business, you're born into a family business. You didn't choose that to begin with, as little as you chose the gender that you're born with. So I think, you know, this is a circumstance you're born into, just as much a coincidence as your gender. I think that the conversation now, it's very attractive to start talking about this as some sort of like enlightenment on the side of the usually patriarchal dominant succession discussion. But the fact of the matter is as well, and we've seen this everywhere, is that the business environment has changed to such a degree, and business leadership decision-making has become so complex that we also have to be quite frank about the fact that it is no longer a viable option to exclude women from this conversation simply because the talent is needed. And I'd love to sit here and think that suddenly everyone became aware that women have just as much to offer in the workplace as men do, but I don't think that's the case. I think that the times are favorable to this, because if you look at the level of complexity, the moving factors that are right now coming into, for me as a family business leader, how I have to take decisions, how many things I have to take into consideration, how much I need to know, how high the level of uncertainty is, to believe that going forward, we can still have one man or even one woman show leadership scenarios is not realistic and will be to the detriment of the sustainability of any business, family or not.
I think this is an excellent note to end on, Ramia. Thank you for that. And I'd like to thank you very much, all three of you, for your contributions to the panel today. We're just going to put up a last slide, which concerns, you know, GEM in general. I mean, you heard that we work with national teams. In this particular study, multiple national teams participated, and it's all about the numbers of national teams that can participate in a study. It really brings a huge amount of credibility and added value. We carry out about 150,000 interviews a year. It's a lot, you know, and this means that this is extremely robust research. So the more national teams we have on board, actually the better. So you'll see on our GEM website that you have all the information about the national teams that we currently have. If your country is missing and you think that it might be feasible to set up a national team in that country, Obviously, we work with credible and reputable institutions and academics. Please do contact us. You'll see on the right-hand side there, not only have we produced this wonderful new family entrepreneurship report with Bill and Matt and many others, but we have also last month launched Diagnosing COVID-19 Impacts on Entrepreneurship report, which is a look at policy impact. And we actually will be doing the same next year with hard data. I mean, that particular report was qualitative data, let's say. We're currently collecting a lot of data on impact of COVID-19, and we'll be producing a report next year on the policy impact as well. And every year we do a highly comprehensive global report. It's the one in the bottom right-hand side of your screen there. It's the global report, and you can have a look at that also on our website. We have a product. We know that entrepreneurship is very much a local issue. And so we have developed a tool to assess ecosystem readiness for entrepreneurship. And that's something you could maybe have a look at on our website. And of course, we're always interested in talking to potential credible partners that might join together with us in our efforts. So there you have it. You have the email, you know where to go. You can download this report that we launched today. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for joining. It's been a pleasure. And thank you to all our panelists. It's been great and informative, and I hope for everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.